The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black responds solidly, establishing a central pawn presence and maintaining dynamic balance in this early stage. White develops the knight, a standard developing move that solidifies the center and maintains equality. The move the knight to c6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to g2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White fianchettos the bishop, preparing for hypermodern central control and maintaining the slight initiative. Black mirrors the fianchetto, mirroring white's strategy and keeping the position balanced. White completes the fianchetto, solidifying the long diagonal and maintaining the slight advantage. Black fortifies the center with a pawn move, maintaining structural integrity and the dynamic balance. White shores up the queenside with a rook move, preparing for pawn expansion and reinforcing the slight edge. Black develops the bishop to a good diagonal, creating counterplay and holding the slight white advantage. White advances a pawn on the queenside, aiming for space and maintaining the slight initiative. Black strikes in the center with a pawn push, creating dynamism and holding the advantage to white. White pushes the queenside pawn further, contesting space and maintaining the slight positional edge. Black repositions the knight, a solid maneuver to improve its coordination and keep the game balanced. White reinforces the center, a strategic move to bolster pawn structure and retain the slight advantage. Black develops the knight, a standard move that increases piece activity and challenges white's central control. The move the pawn to d4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight on the g-file to e2, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to a6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to a4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the a-file takes on b5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on b5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn on the e-file takes on d4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to f1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to h3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking short castles with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to f4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White recaptures, solidifying central presence and maintaining the strong positional superiority. Black castles, a necessary move for king safety that consolidates the position. White develops the knight to a better square, improving piece activity and maintaining dominance. Black pushes a pawn in the center, challenging white's space and seeking dynamic counterplay. The move the queen to a4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to c5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop, activating the piece and creating tactical possibilities. White castles, a logical move for king safety and to connect the rooks. Black develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, increasing pressure. The move the bishop to a3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to c2, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the knight to e4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the knight takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the f-file takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the rook to e8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to a6, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the bishop takes on e7, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on e7, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the knight to e4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White activates the knight, placing it on a strong central outpost. The move the knight to e4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn on the d-file takes on c4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the bishop takes on b7, executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on e7, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on e7, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on a8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White exchanges bishops, simplifying the position and maintaining the advantage. Black exchanges knights, a necessary simplification that doesn't alleviate white's pressure. White captures the knight, winning material and solidifying the decisive advantage. Black captures the bishop, a forced sequence that continues the material exchange. White captures the pawn, further material gain and maintaining overwhelming pressure. Black activates the rook, preparing for counterplay on the open file. White captures a central pawn, increasing control and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the knight, a solid move to avoid further exchanges. White exchanges knights, simplifying into a clearly winning endgame. Black recaptures, activating the rook on the open file. The move the pawn to b6 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to c5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d4, executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to b6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the rook takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the knight to b5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on a2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black captures the pawn, exploiting the structural weakness and maintaining activity. White places the knight on a strong outpost, dominating key squares. Black activates the rook, preparing for defensive or offensive action. White advances a central pawn, aiming to open lines and maintain pressure. Black centralizes the rook, improving its position for potential action. White advances a pawn, creating potential weaknesses but aiming for space. Black repositions the bishop, a solid defensive maneuver improving its scope. White centralizes the rook, preparing for endgame action and maintaining the advantage. Black activates the bishop, aiming at White's king and creating threats. The move the rook to e1 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the b file to c1, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to a4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the bishop to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the bishop to e8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the king to g2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the king, a safe move to avoid complications. White centralizes the other rook, aiming to improve coordination in the endgame. Black centralizes the rook, mirroring White's setup and maintaining the balance. White exchanges rooks, simplifying into a favorable endgame structure. Black recaptures, centralizing the bishop and maintaining piece activity. White advances a pawn, creating a passed pawn threat and controlling space. Black repositions the rook, improving its defensive posture. White centralizes the knight, aiming for a strong outpost and simplifying. Black captures the knight, continuing the simplification process. White forks king and rook, winning material and gaining a decisive advantage. Black moves the king to safety, a necessary defensive move. White activates the rook, preparing to exploit the material advantage. The move the bishop to e8 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to b3, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Paving the way for the rook to a7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the king to f6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the bishop to f1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the king to e5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to g2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the bishop, securing a decisive material advantage. The move the pawn to f4 by Black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the bishop to d7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Afterwards, the knight takes on c5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the b file takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the rook to b8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to b5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c file takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures the pawn, consolidating the overwhelming material advantage. Black recaptures, accepting the material deficit and continuing the game. White delivers check with a pawn, advancing towards promotion and maintaining the winning position. Black moves the king, a forced reaction to the check. White checks with the bishop, a strong tactical move to maintain pressure. Black captures the bishop, a forced recapture to avoid further material loss. White exchanges rooks, simplifying into a winning endgame with a clear material advantage. Black recaptures, maintaining piece coordination despite the material disadvantage. White recaptures the pawn, further consolidating the winning advantage. Black pushes a pawn, a thematic move in the endgame aiming for activity. White delivers check with the rook, forcing the king back and advancing towards victory. Black moves the king, a forced retreat to escape the check. White repositions the bishop, setting up powerful mating threats. The move the rook to d7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to f5, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the bishop to e4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the rook to c6 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to d7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the rook takes on b6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White checks with the rook, a decisive sequence forcing material gain and overwhelming advantage. The move the king to b7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to d8, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the rook takes on b6 executes a favorable trade. Next comes the rook to d1 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the bishop to f1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to d7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to b5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn with check, devastating black's position and securing the win. Black moves the king, an attempt to escape the onslaught. White centralizes the rook, menacing black's king and sealing the victory. Black moves the king, a futile attempt to prolong the game. White repositions the bishop, orchestrating the final mating attack.